his family wished to leave the jail, they had to go out by the medium at the front gate. The story, as I heard it, was he was under curfew to come in. If he wasn't in by a certain time, he didn't get in. But the gate wouldn't be unlocked.
G'day travellers, welcome back to episode 3 of Adelaide. Today we take a look at the old Adelaide Gaol. Get prepared for an eerie look inside Adelaide's grim past. Adelaide Gaol was an Australian prison located in Theberton, South Australia. The jail was the first permanent one in South Australia and operated from 1841 until 1988. The jail is one of the 2 oldest buildings still standing in South Australia, the other being Government House, which was built at the same time. The prison is now a museum, tourist attraction and function centre. Welcome to Yard 1. It was built in 1850 to house women, which it did until 1969 when all female prisoners were transferred to a new facility at Adelaide's Women's Prison. This block had various uses, such as for remand prisoners or for those with infectious diseases. The block was later renamed The Lane, as it both bordered and was accessed from the lane that separated the admin buildings from the cell blocks. In the mid-60s, the upstairs sections were gutted to provide ground floor open dormitory accommodation for prisoners deemed low risk. These prisoners wore suede shoes when work boots were the norm for prisoners, and could have personal items containing materials normally banned, such as glass in photo frames. It also gave easier access to the industries which were in the lane, like the bakehouse and laundry, which was directly below. Female prisoners were held at Adelaide Gaol from the time it opened. For the first few years, they were placed in solitary cells, or in the community cells alongside the men. In 1849 and 50, 3 more yards were built, and the male and female prisoners could finally be segregated. Yard 2 was exclusively a women's area until 1969, when all female prisoners were transferred to Northfield.
This is really gloomy. Being in an old jail, that knowing that people have been in here, people have died here, people have done hideous, unspeakable things to be here is unreal. It makes your stomach just drop. It's crazy. The size of this cell that I'm currently in, I can touch both walls. That's how small this thing is. Like, the fact that some people are locked up here for years is insane. I'm currently in the women's block, but this is ridiculous.
Elizabeth Lillian Woolcock was the only female executed in South Australia. She was convicted of poisoning her husband and was hanged on the jail's portable gallows in December 1873. Reverend Bickford was a welcome visitor in Elizabeth's last days and accompanied her to the gallows on the morning of the execution. This was the jail's induction centre after 1978. Newly admitted prisoners were brought here to be fully examined, showered, and issued with prison clothes. Personal belongings were held in the lockers in the property store next door. The property store building came into the jail as a female dormitory in 1964. From the late 1970s, clothes were cleaned and stored here until needed for court appearances or at release. Some of their clothes were beyond cleaning and were destroyed. This garden was started in the 1930s by a female prisoner whose behaviour had been unmanageable. It was originally much larger, but was reduced when the dormitory was installed in the 1960s. Many of the plants in the garden have been added since the jail closed, but a few original rose bushes still remain. Yard 4 consisted of 2-storey cell blocks, which housed male prisoners. The last 3 cells in the block on the right facing into the yard were the condemned cells. Those under sentence of death were placed in here for the night. There was another area in the laneway where they would spend time during the day. Yard 4 was one of the 2 original yards completed at Adelaide Gaol in 1841. It initially housed debtors, those people jailed to work off outstanding debts. During the jail's operating years, all types of male prisoners, both sentenced and on remand, were accommodated in 4 Yard. Born on the 20th of April 1848, Elizabeth Woolcock and her family lived in the Coringa Creek dugouts of Burra in South Australia. until a flash flood washed their home away in 1852. With no home and having lost all their possessions, Elizabeth's father joined the Victorian gold rush and moved to Ballarat. The rest of the family, along with their babysitter, joined him in October, taking residence in a tent on the goldfields. Her mother disliked Ballarat and described it as this horrid, sin-stained colony of scoundrels and villains, and following the death of Elizabeth's youngest sister not long after their arrival, moved to Adelaide with another man, leaving Elizabeth to be raised by her father. Elizabeth was raped as a child and left for dead by an itinerant Indian in an attack that left her both psychologically disturbed and unable to have children. Her doctors gave her opium for the pain, to which she subsequently became addicted. In 1857 her father died of consumption, and Elizabeth was put into service with the family of a pharmacist in Melbourne, which gave her easy access to the opium she needed to feed her drug habit. In 1865, after receiving news that her mother was still alive and looking for her, Elizabeth travelled to Moonta Moonterra in South Australia and moved in with her mother and stepfather. To support herself, she got work as a housekeeper, on weekends taught Sunday school, and there was evidence she even managed to kick her addiction. In 1866, a relative of the family she worked for arrived from England, and after moving into the household, took over her job, which led to Elizabeth's dismissal. Capital punishment in Australia has been abolished in all jurisdictions. The last execution in Australia took place in 1967, when Ronald Ryan was hanged in Victoria. Most of the wall paintings were done by an artist serving a short jail term. He was asked to paint in areas where prisoners could see and enjoy the artwork. Most were painted from memory, but a few of the smaller ones were copied from magazines. Like any corrections facility, prisoners have successfully escaped from Adelaide Gaol. The first attempt at escaping occurred in August 1854, when 2 prisoners were caught in the act, with each receiving 36 lashes. The first successful escape was in 1897, when 3 prisoners made it as far as Blanchetown before being recaptured. One ingenious, though unsuccessful escape attempt in 1983 involved the prisoner taking his pyjama coat to art classes and painting it to resemble an officer's uniform. The cap is made from a biscuit box.
The railway reported a blanket hanging outside the jail wall. I went to number 4 yard. Warder Smith reported 2 men missing. I went to number 5 yard and found the pig wire broken and evidence of escape. I then proceeded to the northeast tower outside and found a blanket rope hanging from the bars of the tower window and 1 boot. I crossed the railway line and found a jail coat and hat and 1 boot.
Keeper's Journal, 28th of the 3rd, 1948. Thomas Woolcock emigrated from Cornwall and settled in Moonta with his wife and 2 children in 1865. His wife and 1 son contracted a fever and died the following year, and with a young son also named Thomas to care for, he advertised for a live-in housekeeper, for which Elizabeth applied. Elizabeth's stepfather disliked Woolcock and considered the live-in arrangement scandalous. Woolcock, to avoid gossip, married her in the cottage's front parlour. Woolcock turned out to be a heavy drinker, a bully, and a wife-beater. Elizabeth attempted to leave him several times but failed, and eventually attempted suicide by hanging herself in the stable, but the rafter broke, sparing her life. She became addicted again, this time to morphine. The situation improved somewhat when Woolcock took in a boarder, whose presence lessened the abuse she suffered, but eventually he left. Not long after he left, the family dog died after being poisoned, and the boarder was suspected. Around this time, Elizabeth ran out of morphine and began suffering from severe withdrawal symptoms. The chemist refused to prescribe it anymore, and she resorted to sending her stepson to pharmacies with notes and claiming she needed it to get ink stains out. Her desperation to acquire drugs became common knowledge in the community. A month after the dog died, Woolcock became ill with stomach pains and nausea. Elizabeth called in 3 doctors over the following weeks, who each diagnosed different illnesses and prescribed different medications. Dr. Bull prescribed syrup and pills laced with 1/3 of a grain of mercury for a sore throat, but Woolcock became considerably worse, and Elizabeth then called in Dr. Dickey, who diagnosed a gastric disorder and prescribed rhubarb tablets, which had no effect. Finally, Dr. Herbert treated him for a sore throat with excessive salivation. Dr. Herbert's treatment worked, Woolcock was improving, but 2 weeks later, he decided Herbert's treatment was too expensive and went back to Dr. Dickey, who resumed the treatment for a gastric problem. When his condition failed to improve, Elizabeth suggested returning to Dr. Bull, but according to neighbours and friends, who were present and later testified at her trial, Woolcock replied, "I certainly don't want Dr. Bull again, as it was his medicine that made me bad in the first place." At 3 a.m. on the 4th of September 1873, Thomas Woolcock died. Dr. Dickey initially stated his patient had died from pure exhaustion, from excessive and prolonged vomiting and purging. Woolcock's cousin, Elizabeth Snell, suggested to the doctor that as everyone knew Woolcock's wife had been getting morphia, she could have poisoned him, and rumours of foul play began spreading. Dr. Dickey ordered an inquest, largely to quash the rumours, as he still believed his original diagnosis was correct. These almost code-looking texts written upon the inner wall of the jail are actually tombstones, the number referring to in what order they were hanged. The letters refer to the initials of the deceased person's full name, and the date corresponds with the date of death.
This is a bit low-key terrifying. So the woman shown before her cell, she was hung here, and I've just found out they've actually got bodies buried within the jail. So anyone that was hung by the neck until dead at this jail would then be property of the jail to dispose of. So they would bury the bodies within the jail walls. So I've actually just found her effectively headstone with a date there. It's actually really creepy to think that, like I was saying before, it's so surreal and it's really heavy knowing what these people have done, but to know that they're also still here is a really scary thought.
Elizabeth Woolcock, the only woman hanged in South Australia. Elizabeth was convicted of the murder of her husband Thomas, who died in Moonta after several weeks of illness. An autopsy revealed that he had died of mercury poisoning, and Elizabeth was committed for trial based on circumstantial evidence. A jury took less than 30 minutes to find the 26-year-old guilty, but recommended mercy because of her youth. She was sentenced to be hanged, at which time the judge added that as the 21 days from the passing of sentence will expire on Christmas Day, I will have to fix a date for your execution, which will take place on Tuesday the 30th of December, 1873. The jury's plea for mercy was ignored, and shortly before 8 a.m. on the determined day, Elizabeth was taken from the condemned cell and walked along the laneway to the portable gallows, accompanied by the Reverend Bickford and the governor of the jail. She was wearing a plain white dress and carried a bunch of flowers. Elizabeth was described as being aware of her situation, but calm and collected as she mounted the scaffold.